Ladies and gentlemen, round one, Gridlink, Coronet Juniper, Willowtip Records, a record I was extremely excited for, as were, I think, a lot of you guys who are frequent listeners to the show. In the interest of not going for clickbait, short version, it's a masterpiece, and it may be Gridlink's best album. It's immediately one of the best of the year. Long version. Gridlink is a band that I've enjoyed for a long time. Like a lot of people, I got introduced to them through Longhena, which was their third and for a while final full length after Takafumi Matsubara, the primary guitarist, had, I want to say, a brain aneurysm or something to that effect that substantially hindered his ability to play guitar and required a really long physical recovery. But after a lot of years, Gridlink is back, and I anticipated that this would be excellent. I couldn't imagine that Gridlink would fail, given the stuff that the members had done in their spare time, like No One Knows What the Dead Think, and Takafumi Matsubara's solo project, Strange, Beautiful, and Fast. So I had little doubt that this was going to be phenomenal. And I'm really not disappointed. This really does... It does everything that was done so well on Longhena, which I think everyone can agree really was just the apex of Gridlink's career. The first two records, Orphan and Ambergray, are excellent, but Longhena is just clearly their best album. So I guess the most impressive thing about Coronet Juniper is that it managed to take what seemed like a perfect record in Longhena and perfect it further and pin down even more precisely what makes Gridlink so special. I'll get a little bit into where I think this falls musically, because I think I have a different answer to that than a lot of people would, but Black Metal Guy, were you exposed to Gridlink before I showed them to you? Like, were you already familiar to a pretty good degree, right?
I was already generally familiar. I'd heard some of it and thought, hey, this is really cool. And I'd seen some videos of him playing, maybe not Gridlink riffs, but playing his signature hyperspeed speed metal riffs in the course of his recovery. A friend of mine who was really into shred showed me them. Mm-hmm. And, it's very cool. I was excited for this record, and I'm, glad that he's back operating at peak capacity. I didn't have, like, a huge Gridlink background at all.
Oh, okay. So this will be, like, kind of your first full length with them.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. So I'll ask you your opinions, but I want to frame it in a certain way. So I'm going to make the argument that Coronet Juniper is the best screamo record of the year. Like, very much in the vein of something like Swarm, although obviously executed differently with an emphasis on different parts of itself. But now I'm going to spend the rest of the review walking that back and talking about how heavy metal it is, structurally and in terms of riffcraft. For those who haven't heard Longhena, this is really a further iteration on that idea. These sorts of very fast, very technical melodic riffs that are really at their heart almost traditional heavy metal riffs. Or, as you said, like technical speed metal riffs. What this is the most unlike, in a lot of ways to me, is other grindcore, which is funny because Gridlink is known as this flagship sort of technical grindcore band. But I'm not sure that really fits. Sure, the songs are dense and short and very impactful and based off of just a few fundamental ideas, but I think there's a way you get to this record that can bypass Napalm Death entirely. I'm sure the guys in Gridlink love Napalm Death, but I think there's a way you get here without that. So where do you think this falls? In terms of, like, how would you describe it to... because I just feel like the grindcore label is a little bit of a misnomer.
I think it's right, but just in the most broad sense. I mean, bro, does it grind? It grinds, right? I think in terms of the screamo stuff that you're mentioning as an influence on it, that's undeniable. But whether you're talking about Swarm and Envy or other Japanese bands, or whether you're talking about, like One-Eyed God, Prophecy, or Orchid or whatever, right? All those bands had a pretty heavy grindcore influence, right? Or Page 99 or whatever, right? That's like the main screamo reference points are very grindy themselves. So I think, our standard, I get what you mean in that they're pretty much zero grindcore riffs on here. But we've talked many times about how there really isn't such a thing as a grindcore riff. Like, there are a few exceptions to that in bands that practice the style in a very pure and ascetic way, like Internal Rot, right? We're like, okay, that can't exist in any context other than grindcore. These are grind riffs. But generally, right, and I'm rehearsing shit for listeners who haven't heard it yet, but, like, generally speaking, we think of grind as about taking riffs from all over the map, right? From death metal, originally from death metal and crust punk and whatnot, and then stringing them together in specific kinds of song structures to produce a desired effect, right? It grinds. And that's one thing that gives it the chaotic, everything thrown in a blender feel. It has to do with pacing and sequencing and tempo. So there's, I think maybe what marks it as so different is he's doing the grind procedure on extremely different raw material. You might hear grind bands that have bits of melodeath thrown in, right? In various ways. Like what was, I remember people thought of, was Sinus as unusually melodic for like a crust grind band or things like that. But it is, and you might hear melody by way of a bit of black metal or something, but the idea that the primary melodic material for the riffs is heavy metal, speed metal, and the most sort of elaborate melodeath and Swedish black death. That's pretty unfamiliar.
Yeah, I mean, you really get to the center of what's kind of my thesis statement about Gridlink at this point, which is that Gridlink is so remarkable because, well, amongst many things, but the most prominent thing is Takafumi Matsubara is such a genius-level guitarist that he is able to take, I believe, just like full melodies from other bands and recontextualize them in such a way that they belong to him specifically. Takafumi is technically a wizard, but more importantly, he understands how to write memorable melodies in such an intuitive way and in such a sort of casual, off-the-cuff way where he can just snatch something out of an At the Gates song, rework it slightly in his own idioms, and it's entirely new. Because you and I both noticed just tons of things across this record that either could be or just are nods to other music. I was talking to you the other night and I said that there is a melody on this record where the riff is an interpolation of a vocal melody from the theme to Neon Genesis Evangelion, which it makes perfect sense for this band. I've
been rewatching it.
Oh, have you?
Yeah. With my girl. It's.
Oh, I'll also talk. I would like to say you have a great note in here about your conspiracy for the release date, which I think I believe.
Yeah, timed for the release of Armored Core 6.
Yes, because Gridlink is like a video game and anime band. It's great.
Gridlink understands what people listen to extreme metal for. Do they listen to it for flailing socio-political grievance? No, they listen to it for giant machines shooting lasers.
Oh yeah, I love the art. I love the mecha with the lasers, and then if you look closely, you realize it's probably a miniature that they've taken a photo of.
Oh, that's sick.
That's so cool. I love that idea. And frankly,
I definitely don't own any Ava miniatures.
Yeah, I'd also like to say that Gridlink, it should not be a typical thing in extreme music, but they're like slick, hyper modern aesthetic. I really enjoy. I love all the sans serif typefaces, the neon colors. It's awesome.
Yeah, I like there's no sort of beating around the bush here. It's just like, yes, we know the music sounds like anime, and yes, it's about anime. It's or it's not about anime. It's not dependent. It's not just like Evangelion themed, right? It's doing its own thing, but it's doing it in the same sort of cultural imaginary as anime, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to underscore what you're saying, because I really like that point you made. And if someone is listening casually, like as they try not to chop their finger joints off at the machine shop, they might have heard what you were saying as sort of a reiteration of the kind of thing I was saying. But you're making a really specific point, which is it's not just that Matsubara is lifting... it's not just that he's doing the regular grind thing, i.e. ripping off and lifting riff styles and arranging them in this original way, right? It's that the riffs themselves, when you zero in on the riffs, you can hear that they're in many cases almost literally borrowed from other bands, and yet they sound completely transmuted by his particular approach to writing and particular approach to, sort of phrasing and delivery. Right?
Yeah. Well, no, absolutely. And I'd also like to say that, the thing that's most impressive is that he's able to take such disparate ideas, recontextualize them, and then package them together into this totally unified aesthetic where a heavy metal riff next to a DSBM riff next to a grind riff next to an anime theme song sounds completely contiguous.
Yeah, and that is the grind thing. I mean, so it's like he's doing... Normally the grind effect is you borrow content and you give it a grindy form. Here he's doing that, but your point is that he's also grindifying the riffs themselves. He's acting on the content, the borrowed content, as well as the form, so that it all becomes thoroughly his, even when they're very elaborate hook melodies that might be a signature from another band. Like an At the Gates riff might be really heavy, but it doesn't grind. An At the Gates riff delivered by Matsubara grinds.
Yes.
And it sounds like his riff, even though note for note you might rearrange it and be like, hey, this is a sick part on Slaughter of the Soul.
Yeah, it is. If you want the quote for the sticker on the jewel case, it is, Coronet Juniper is a masterpiece of collage art, basically. Yeah.
Like the highest level on which one can grind.
Yeah, pretty much. It's like within the... Remember how I said, ad nauseum close the door on Disso Death? Gridlink kind of closes the door on anything in this vein except for another Gridlink record. They don't have a ton of competition, which is strange because people love this band. But it's almost impossible. How is anyone going to try to imitate this? This is just so masterful in its craftsmanship. I mean, this is the product of decades and decades of musical experience and songwriting knowledge. You can't do this listening at home.
And the years of recovery for him means that you can't. In a way, he has had the disasters in the right hands can produce opportunities. And in a way, this is his second shot at a first album. Very often the first album has exponentially more years of writing in it than any subsequent record for a band. And in this case, it's been fucking 9 years, and you can guarantee even when he couldn't play, he was humming riffs and recording them.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's he's had 9 fucking years, so in a way, as much life history has gone into this one record as into Amber Gray.
Yeah, it is. It is titanic in its scope in less than 20 minutes.
All right.
Let's grind.
Well, wait, sorry. You're going to say one more? Okay,
No.
let's grind. So we've talked a lot about, we started with the thing that this is basically a screamo record, and then we've talked a lot about how it's like, how it relates to, how it also is a grindcore record, and how it relates to, its riffing source material. Now let's get back to the screamo thing. You can hear how, despite this grindy composition method and these riffs that are just epic heavy metal, this is, in terms of overall mood, quintessentially a screamo record, and in the sort of Japanese vein. So this is track 1 from the beginning, Silk Ash Cascade. Yeah, so that riff that we faded out on, and that we also start on, that's a classic example of a metal riff that is, we've talked about this before, there are certain riffs that are metal riffs, right? That it could have been a Maiden riff, but the way it's delivered is specifically screamo and its close cousin, American metalcore.
Yeah, it's screamo thunderstruck.
Exactly. Oh, really nicely put. Yes. It's screamo thunderstruck, and it's you could hear it in an especially metallic part of a Thursday record. You could hear it in something like that with a different tone in like Darkest Hour, or even even the second Thrice record,
or Unearth. Unearth would do
Unearth. Yeah. So all of these classic sort of melodic metalcore bands and moments like that in, I mean, there's also like riffs basically like that in many of the screamo bands we mentioned at the beginning, but maybe a little less heavy metal. But yeah, that's a classic sort of high stakes anticipatory screamo riff, and then it sort of launches into something that you called while we were listening to it, like the one kind of distinctive Gridlink riff there is. How would you describe that?
Yeah, so we'll hear it a few times on these samples, but it's a sort of tense minor key, but not really dark climbing chord progression, with either a sort of technical melodic fragment looping over it, or just like an octave matching climbing, like wailing trem guitar. That's a specific figure that gets used across the Gridlink discography. So it's a uniquely Takafumi thing.
So it's this kind of moving pedal point thing drawn from, which is similar to things in Melodeath or even in like Marduk or whatever, but here it's being used. Here this is his idiom, right? It's and over it there's some active guitar filling in that space, whereas say, I don't know, Marduk would certainly just like keep the pedal point on the root, and the Melodeath bands might try to The melodeath bands might be less abstract about it. They try to fill in a melody on the rhythm guitar instead of putting it all in whatever crazy shit the lead is doing.
Yeah, it's he likes I think Takafumi likes having a sort of intense negative space between guitar lines. You know, he doesn't like intertwining leads so much as like a very deep rhythm guitar and a very high spindly lead.
That's a good point, and I really like that. It allows the two guitar parts to be genuinely distinct and interacting, as opposed to falling into the lead and rhythm pattern.
Yes, and well, it's also helped by Gridlink appreciates a sort of thin production. I think this is probably going to be the best produced album of the year. The drum production alone is fucking insane. In some of the just solo drum parts, the amount of body and tone color you get from the drums is spectacular. Obviously, the drumming performance is also just absurd. So Gridlink does appreciate their roots in this sort of, this is considered the spiritual successor to something like Discordance Axis, which I kind of agree with and kind of don't. But Discordance Axis was one of the flagship sort of white belt grind bands, which really means screamo grind. We just didn't know that at the time. But they always had an appreciation for a thin, grindy production. The guitars are strong, but they don't have what you would call a lot of heaviness or body to them. And it makes the musical soundscape very spacious because it's not getting clotted up with quite as much guitar saturation as you get from a regular metal record.
That's a very good point, and I would say for listeners, contrast that thin sound, deliberately thin sound from the just unbelievably beefy sound of other popular grind bands from that area, namely like Nazem and Rotten Sound or Pig Destroyer.
Yeah, those are trying to be.
And the thin sound here it's also a screamo thing. I mean, maybe Discordance Axis is getting it from their own place, but here it's a screamo thing that is. Although it sounds like Discordance Axis were white belt, right? So that's a screamo production convention.
Discordance was very screamo, but more kind of noisy, angular screamo.
Right. So the thin production is typical of that, and it's kind of a glassy. It brings it pretty close to a glassy tone, like you would get in post-punk. Post-punk or goth or anything like that, but it's being played in a much more aggressive way. But yeah, that's it, and it brings attention to the guitar texture and creates this more sort of, for a lot of the screamo bands, it can be a more sort of angsty and collapsing mood, or it can be sort of more ethereal. Yeah, but anyway, why don't we go to yours?
Yeah, sure. So we're going to go to the third track on this record and just listen to the whole thing. This is called Pitch Black Resolve. It's one of my favorites on the record. And here we're going to get back to a couple things. One being that this opens with the thing that I'm calling the Gridlink riff, that arrangement of like upward climbing chord progressions. But it's also going to touch on something that you pointed out, which is a proximity to American metalcore, which is, joined at the hip with screamo and is also very important to this band because there is just one of those incredibly greasy sort of pentatonic God forbid, like a God forbid riff or like a Lamb of God riff, like a new wave of American heavy metal riff, but played at a blinding speed that loses none of the inherent swagger. So yeah, let's listen to Pitch Black Resolve. This whole thing fucking rules.
Ah!
That like I never thought that Gridlink would play a riff that sounds like you're entering a pool hall in a movie from 2005. And there's a bunch of rough guys inside in leather jackets, but then they play it like 40% too fast, and it has a character all its own. I love the contrast of the ideas.
There's also crazy follow through on it. Like the riff actually has a very elaborate shape in a way that might be you might not get from Pantera.
Yeah. It's got triple the notes of a Pantera riff, but
it's sort of like circle. It does this kind of circle. It's big stacked power, big like rising power chords that move in a kind of like in a sort of arpeggio circle or something.
Well, you pointed out a similarity to Skeleton Witch on the big Melodeath riff there.
Yeah. So that's after the big, after the throwdown bluesy riff. You get that. Yeah, the sort of more sort of beautiful, beautiful thrashing riff. That is, it's very influenced by Melodeath and Swedish Black Death, but it really sort of conspicuously thrashes in it rather that is sort of. It goes with the thinner production on this record. If you play those kinds of big Melodeath if you play a Melodeath riff and you chord it in a kind of black metal-y way, and you're playing it with screamo production, it's going to sound a lot like Skeleton, which is more sort of elegant moments. I'm thinking of like, I don't know how they sounded later. I'm just thinking of like Beyond the Permafrost.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you touched on, the sort of inherently American quality, because I want to touch on the fact that this is like very much an American band and a Japanese band rolled into one.
I think that's a very good point.
And they really sort of appreciate the furthest eccentricities of their respective regions. Things very unique to those places coming into collision in a really cool way. Something I also noticed, especially on your first sample, is the chord voicings that Takafumi is using are, because I was listening to them in the car today, they sound like The Carrier in a lot of ways. This sort of merging of melodic hardcore and screamo chord voicing. It's so fucking cool. But I want you to get more into the Melodeath, because we've got a great one on the next sample.
Well, I'm glad you got The Carrier in there. Yeah, that's a very good point. Super underrated band because they played screamo chords or with like the elegance that they would be played in a black metal band, right? Just like really fully fleshed out melodies and harmonies.
But with also like just the sort of like knuckle dragging intensity of Hatebreed. It's so cool.
Oh yeah, on the mosh parts, for sure. So this next one, so basically like
the first
Pitch Black Resolve.
The first half of this record is like an unbroken chain of genius songs.
Yeah. Pitch Black Resolve ends, and then Nickel Grass Mosaic starts immediately. One aspect of grind writing is that the songs interact with each other far more than on any other kind of record. They're written together. So you think you just got done. You're like, oh shoot, the epic Melodeath part is over. Well, that's where you're wrong.
Oh, just a bear of a little tiny song. Jesus.
Yeah, that's a huge, tiny song. So, I mean, the balls it takes to lead with that riff. Like, as with the big sort of Lamb of God riff on the last song, he's so good at playing melodies that... He plays kinds of melodies that the first time you heard them when you were 15 blew your fucking mind.
Yeah.
Right? And
then you hate them for another 20 years.
Exactly. You grow older, and if you don't hate them, you allow them only in in specific contexts, right? You're like, okay, well, I like that for what it is, right? But that's like, it's Pantera. Or, oh, that's silly, that's like fun, indulgent metalcore or whatever, right? You put them in their corner and you move on to bands from Belarus who can't play their instruments. But like, he's so good at taking that just sort of massive Dorian chord progression riff and just Dorian sort of, it feels a little minor, a little pentatonic, and just through speed, through delivery, and through that sort of well-rounded, fleshed-out form, the way it goes down the descent, just nailing it and reminding you why those riffs are actually great.
Yeah, and that Dorian melody, that really elaborate winding one, that's the one that's the fucking Neon Genesis Evangelion theme, because you can interpolate over it exactly, that song that people use in the meme videos, the dun 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 dun.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Dude, it's the same fucking melody. He's changed it slightly because I noticed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that the way he arranged it before I realized what it was, sometimes Takafumi will arrange these leads more like vocal melodies in terms of like how he's staggering the notes. They're not really played in a guitar idiom. They're played in a vocal idiom. And then I pieced it together with the notation, and I was like, the madman's done it. The madman's done exactly this.
Man, so also in terms of that huge riff, something that made me think of was Nagelfar, Sweden, which is technically Black Death, but, there's a spectrum from Black Death to Melodeath. It's really just one style, and we don't have a good name for it yet. But it's... The Nagelfar record, although it's sort of black metal, is as indulgent and, willfully fruity as any Melodeath record, and they'll totally do things like that, just like big... thick chords moving up a really epic progression, right? But yeah, anyway, just wanted to mention them, and that also links to one of the next riffs. Pretty quickly after that, the Skeleton Witch riff returns for a very similar one. That sort of nimble, muted and chorded riff. So he's not just linking the songs in an extremely meaningful way. He's also deliberately doing modular songwriting where riffs from other songs reappear later to unify the thing. And at the end, he does something that's really grindy. He hits this sort of lead, big low end lead, sort of death metal style single string trem. Or something, and he just sits on the fragment, deliberately kind of stuttering it and winding up tension, and that's a very grindy thing to do.
Yes, it is. The most extreme grindcore stuff comes around the fringes in moments like that are used for very deliberate effect. But one more instance of Takafumi sort of appropriating material from radically different styles and repurposing it. We're going to go to the next song, Ocean Vertigo. This song is almost entirely based off of a DSBM riff. And Takafumi plays a bunch of different subtle variations of it that bring out different tone color and different chord voicings. I also want to say, just before I forget, that this record compares really strongly to the contrastic record Mammon that was my favorite of 2020. It's got the same sort of like futuristic, kind of sad emo metalcore grind thing. And I didn't think
exhilarating sadness.
Yeah, pure Ghost in the Shell shit. And I didn't think I would hear more of that until I heard this record. So let's listen to Takafumi just take a stock DSBM riff and make the coolest shit in the world out of it. Fuck music, man. I don't want to do this shit anymore.